1 Corinthians 1:30. And the comment concerning obedience in the Christian life, Desire of Ages 668. But of him are ye in Christ Jesus, who of God is made unto us wisdom and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. Jesus is our wisdom. Jesus is our righteousness. Jesus is our sanctification. And Jesus is our redemption. No difference. And we can do nothing more about our sanctification than Jesus. Verse 31, that according as it is written, he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. Now, our comment from Desire of Ages, page 668. All true obedience comes from the heart. I'd like to emphasize those words this evening. All true obedience comes from the heart. Does that emphasis mean anything? We might say, well, there's some true obedience that comes from the heart, and there's some true obedience that comes from another source. But it is all true obedience comes from the heart, and all true obedience comes from the heart. Then would it be safe to say that any obedience, apparent obedience, that doesn't come from the heart is not true obedience? Is that going too far? And if it's not true obedience, what kind of obedience would it be? False obedience. And then it goes on to say, it was heart work with Christ. Even Christ is our great example in this. And if we consent, he will so identify himself with our thoughts and aims, so blend our hearts and minds into conformity to his will, that when obeying him, we shall be but carrying out our own impulses. We have used the term again and again, impulsive obedience, as true obedience. When we know God as it is our privilege to know him, our life will be a life of continual obedience. Through communion with God, sin will become hateful to us. Now, the last two times we have talked more specifically about the will. And our major conclusion has been that if we will use our will and our willpower toward one thing, toward coming into that meaningful daily relationship with God, that he will take control of our direction in our lives and will lead us to the place where he is constantly, ultimately, willing and doing within us on the rest of the things. So we use our will, and we always have our will to use, toward knowing God. And we noticed last time that it is God that wills and does within us on the rest of it. Now we have two things we want to do tonight. We'd like to pick up from the students' comments 2 weeks ago concerning the problem that seems to be developing in our group here. Problem of possible misunderstanding and problem of worry and concern. And then we want to try and deal briefly with a question that came out something like this last time. Does forced obedience or does righteousness by works ever lead to natural obedience or righteousness by faith? I'm not sure that's exactly the way it was stated, but that was the idea, I believe. All right, the student that sort of clarified the issue 2 weeks ago didn't know that he was going to be typed off of the tape recording, but I am going to read his words back to him now. I thought they were particularly good. I'd like to say that I think, it seems to me that what's been the problem maybe is that we're talking about an ideal setup whereby my desire is to do all that God wants me to do all the time because my relationship with Him is perfect. He does the living and I am not living anymore. And if my efforts are successful toward this, then there's no need for effort toward doing or carrying out the things. The problem is that I don't know how many of us here are really in that position of totally depending on God for every area of our lives all the time. If we were, I guess that's where this word perfection we don't like to talk about would come in. So since none of us are in that position, all of us are finding that we have to put out effort to overcome the sins in our lives. And it's the very fact that we have to put out effort that should put on the little blinker lights telling us that we aren't depending fully on God. Now, that can be a problem because then people can be more discouraged because they think that when they find themselves struggling with sin, or should we say sins, they're in a worse position because that also tells them that they're not depending fully on God. And that's why it's not a thing that in some sense maybe is nice to tell or to teach or to try and help people with. But it's beautiful because it's the only way it's going to work. And even though it will seem, as people try and work out this effort business, that when you're putting forth effort to know God, you don't have to put out effort for the other, how many of us are perfect in our efforts to know Him yet? In reality, while we're growing in this sanctification process, we cannot help but find ourselves putting out effort to get rid of sin because we're not perfect right now. It's not right, but it is reality. And this part of reality is a problem that maybe some of us have been thinking you haven't stressed. And in not stressing it, people get a little nervous. Hey, you don't think that exists? I'm telling you it exists. A little modern college vernacular here. All I want to say is, in my experience, reality is I have not conquered. I have not given my will all the time in every problem that comes up to God. And when I don't, it never fails. I have to put out effort to not do that thing. But whenever I figure out, Lord, I want to go your way, and that happens in the devotional life, whenever that happens, I want to go His way. There's no problem trying not to do this or do that. I wouldn't do anything else. That's all I have to say. Period. I still think this clarified an issue that's very real. And I'd like to take one or two areas of this and invite you to look at it. The first one is this. Since none of us are in that position of total dependence upon God all the time, we are finding that we have to put out effort to overcome the sins in our lives. Now, on the basis of our studies so far, are we really overcoming the sins in our lives when we're doing that? On the basis of our study so far, I'd like to suggest that we are only, for those who are successful with their efforts, overcoming the external acts in our lives by these kind of efforts. And it is well said that when we have to find ourselves struggling with some powerful temptation or temptations, And we find ourselves struggling because we are having a response to them. And we have to grit our teeth to keep from doing them. That kind of effort also tells us that we're not depending fully upon God in that thing or at that time. I thought that was well said. Now, do you agree with the problem suggested? That people then become more discouraged when they are told that putting forth strong efforts toward things that they're trying to control, because inwardly they're not changed yet, that this is going to cause discouragement because it tells us that we're not depending on God. Now, does this need to cause discouragement? Or are there several options, several choices as to what this kind of signal can tell us and what it can do for us and where it can lead us? The other thing is, in the next to the last paragraph in this letter, in reality, while we're growing, we cannot help but find ourselves putting out effort to get rid of sin. And I'd like to add these words, externally or morally, because we're not perfect right now. It's not right, but it is reality. Now again, I'd like to remind us that probably every one of us here have experienced or are presently experiencing the need, in order to preserve our reputation, in order to stay out of jail, in order to keep our job, in order to be outwardly nice to people, we are probably, most of us, experiencing a certain amount of forced obedience every day. But the point we're trying to make in this series is that forced obedience is not righteousness. And it is not salvation. It is not real obedience. And it is not Christianity. It is only morality. Now, if a large cross-section of Christendom has been depending upon its morality for its acceptance with God or its sense of having some kind of obedience or for what it is that makes them Christians or anything else, if a large cross-section of people have been depending on their morality, then it wouldn't be surprising if we found this kind of a new thought, would it? And maybe some of us might even find it hard to take, because in a sense it's like pulling the rug out from underneath us as to what has been our security. What we want to do is to acknowledge that we all experience this kind of thing, but let's stop calling it righteousness. Let's stop calling it obedience. Let's stop calling it salvation. Let's stop saying that it has anything to do with Christianity. And let's admit that it is nothing more than morality. And that God has a better plan, which He calls true obedience, real obedience, which is impulsive obedience, natural obedience. Which leads us to this other question. Does righteousness by works, or does forced obedience ever lead to the real experience or to natural obedience? And we need to ask the question, would God use a method antagonistic to His ultimate method to get us to His ultimate. Would He? What does the Bible call our righteousness that we can produce? Do you recall? Filthy rags, Isaiah 64:6. The only kind of righteousness that we can produce is not righteousness, it is the appearance of righteousness, and it is external. Because no one can change his heart. So we could rephrase the question another way. Do filthy rags ever lead to white raiment? Would that be safe to do? Or perhaps we could even go a little more homey. Does a Model T Ford ever lead to a... Oh, I had the name of that. Granada? Is that the new one now? Do spots on a leopard ever lead to stripes? Does being good by not being bad ever lead to really being good in God's way? I'd like to give you a quick list of texts, the usual ones, concerning our condition. And one of our students pointed this out here the other night. That if we really understand our condition, there's no way of trying to suggest that there's any kind of real righteousness in what we can produce. Romans 3:10, there is none righteous. 1 John 5:17, all unrighteousness is sin. Romans 3:23, all have sinned. And verses 10 to 12 for extra reading. 1 John 1:8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. Romans 5:12 and 17 to 19, by one man sin entered, and death by sin, and therefore death and sin have passed upon all men. Psalm 51:5, we were born in sin. Ephesians 2 verse 3, we are by nature the children of wrath. Jeremiah 13:23, can the Ethiopian change his skin or the leopard his spots? Then can ye do good who are accustomed to do evil. Job 14 verse 4, who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? Not one. How are you going to get white raiment from filthy rags? The only way that a Model T can lead me to a new Granada is for me to realize how worthless my Model T is and to drive it off a cliff. Or, that is, push it off a cliff. When it comes to making any kind of a worthwhile trip. There is a sense in which a Model T Ford could lead you to a new Granada. But it has nothing to do, or nothing whatever, with changing the Model T into a Granada. Right? It is simply realizing how helpless and how hopeless my Model T is, and giving up on my Model T in order that I might buy something better. 1 Samuel 16:7, God looks not on the outward appearance, but God looks where? At the heart. Isaiah 1 verse 6, our condition as sinners is described as putrefying sores. Do putrefying sores ever lead to baby skin? Romans 7:18, in my flesh dwelleth no good thing. Jeremiah 17 verse 9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Now, it seems to me one of the crowning arguments concerning the question of whether righteousness by works or forced obedience or external obedience ever leads to the real thing would be our understanding of what God thinks of Laodicea. Revelation 3. You're very familiar with it. We've looked at this before. I'd just like to have you notice one phrase. First of all, what is Laodicea? Laodicea's condition is the same as the condition of the people in the days of Christ's first advent. What was their condition? Matthew 23, we've studied earlier, shows us that their condition was outward goodness without inward goodness. And we've noticed earlier that lukewarm is a combination of hot and cold, and the combination in Laodicea comes out being hot on the outside but cold on the inside. Now, we find in the message to Laodicea what God thinks of this and what kind of value God places on it. Lukewarmness is forced obedience. What does God think about it? Revelation 3. Verse 15. Thou art neither cold nor hot. I would thou wert cold or hot. Or another way of saying it, I wish you were cold or hot. Now, if God would rather have the Laodicean cold than lukewarm, then cold is actually better than lukewarm in a sense, isn't it? Why would cold be better than lukewarm in a sense? Because a person who is cold looks for what? Something that will make him warm. A person who is lukewarm couldn't care less. Does lukewarmness ever lead to hot? Or in a sense, isn't lukewarmness really cold without knowing it? And is there anything worse than being cold and not know it? I was reading one of these new books that came out. What's the name of the book? How to Live the Victorious Life by whoever. Tom Davis. He describes the man who is lost in a snowstorm. It is a beautiful presentation of this premise, don't go by your feelings. The man is hopelessly lost, and all of a sudden, in the freezing cold, he gets this warm glow over him. It's a bad night to bring this up, I guess. Just realized now what I'm doing. And this warm glow, this warm feeling invites him to do what? Lie down and go to sleep. But he's heard about this kind of thing before. And he knows that this is one of the most dangerous symptoms. So he denies his feelings and keeps slogging through the snow. Right? But if he really was to get into this warm glow, this kind of lukewarm feeling, and give in to that, it would have been far better that he'd never had that lukewarm feeling, right? Far better. Now it also says in this passage concerning Laodicea that God is going to spew out the lukewarm out of his mouth. It seems to me that tells you what value God places upon it. There's also a description of the typical Laodicean in the book Steps to Christ, page 44. There are those who profess to serve God while they rely upon their own efforts to obey His law. Now, does this have to be my own efforts without any kind of attempt to be religious? Or can I still have my own efforts in the ongoing religious life and think these efforts are worth something? I think that this would be the logical time to read one other by the same author in the book Selected Messages, Volume 1, page 353. Some people think they are committing themselves to God while there is a great deal of self-dependence. There are conscientious souls that trust partly to God and partly to themselves. They do not look to God to be kept by His power, but they depend upon watchfulness against temptations and the performance of certain duties for acceptance with Him. There are no victories in this kind of faith. Such persons toil to no purpose. What does it say? This kind of faith becomes a bridge to something better later? What does it say about it? There are no victories in this kind of faith. Such persons toil to no purpose. Their souls are in continual bondage, and they find no rest until their burdens are laid at the feet of Jesus. You know what the very next sentence says? There is need of constant watchfulness and of earnest, loving devotion. But these will come naturally when the soul is kept by the power of God through faith. These will come naturally. All right, then let's continue with the statement in Steps to Christ, page 44. There are those who profess to serve God while they rely upon their own efforts to obey His law. This doesn't have to be talking about just the ice-cold person who has nothing to do with religion. Obviously, God's law is involved here. This could be a Seventh-day Adventist sitting on the church pew, couldn't it? They rely upon their efforts to form a right character and to secure salvation. Their hearts are not moved by any deep sense of the love of Christ, but they seek to perform the duties of the Christian life as that which God requires of them in order to gain heaven. And then, do you know what the next sentence says concerning whether this becomes a delightful bridge into the real thing? It says, such religion is worth, you know how much? Nothing. Such religion is worth nothing. Now, I'd like to suggest once more as to why it could be worth nothing. The people who are geared toward trying hard to obey, again, can fall into two categories of extremes. The strong person who places stock in this kind of thing tricks himself into thinking that he succeeds with his outward obedience, and thereby becomes more independent, because he did it by his own grit and determination, and this invariably leads him to become more self-sufficient and not need God as much, and he also becomes proud of his apparent successes. And the weak person who is trying to grit his teeth and force himself to obey and is looking for this as the standard operating procedure in the Christian life and counting this real obedience, invariably fails and becomes discouraged. Right? Becomes discouraged. So it's a dead-end street for both the strong person and the weak person. So it seems that the only option we have left, if this kind of thing is worth nothing, is to admit, number one, we're all going to keep doing it until we know more of God's grace and power to obey naturally. But let's stop calling it real obedience. Let's stop calling it obedience at all. Let's call it what it really is, external morality. And let's stop saying that we're Christians because we are moral. And let's stop saying we have any kind of righteousness because we're being moral. And let's stop thinking we'll have any hope of heaven because we're being moral. Is this fair at all? Is this coming through at all? Let's admit it for what it is face it, admit our immaturity, that we haven't grown where God wants to take us yet. And look forward to a deeper and deeper experience of the real thing, instead of calling this the real thing. Now, I'd also, in the same breath, sort of a PS here before we turn the time over to you, like to admit that there are some real benefits from morality. Once more, let's admit that there are benefits from morality as far as the world is concerned. If I hate you, but I keep from killing you, there are going to be real benefits to me and to you both. If I teach a class over here, I was telling my class the other day, if I teach a class and there are some students that are rubbing me the wrong way and I just don't like the way they're behaving in class and I want to go up and slap them, there are going to be some real benefits for me if I keep from slapping them. I will have a little better reputation. I might be able to keep teaching the class a little longer and maybe even be pastor a little longer in this hill. But if I want to go up and slap them, I've already lost the battle. I've already failed. And let's not call not slapping them any kind of righteousness or obedience or victory. It is not. It is morality. Being moral on the highway will keep me from getting traffic tickets and help me keep my license a little longer. There are benefits. Even though I want to drive 90 miles an hour, if I keep it down, there will be benefits on that. But all of the benefits from morality are worldly benefits. They are not benefits as far as salvation or Christianity are concerned. Well, probably take an unfair advantage of the front here again. And so let's see what your comments. We have some new faces tonight. And by the way, those people who like to get up every time and think they have something good to say, we don't argue with that. That isn't the problem at all. It's that there might be some others that have something good to say too. Okay? I wish we could hear everybody every night. Let's see where we are this evening. Yes, over here.
I want to ask a question. We started out talking tonight about forced obedience versus spontaneous obedience. And I try to examine my experience, and I see some areas, I think, where there's spontaneous obedience. I hope there's not any forced obedience. But I find myself more often than not in what I hope is a middle category. I'm going to get your opinion on this. I've never heard you speak about it. Isn't it possible that the experience of getting to know God better is a progressive experience? And likewise, our experience with sin can be a progressive experience as we get to know God better. So that there could be a time when I'm overcoming sins, not in my own strength, but in the strength of the Spirit. But at the same time, like what I believe Romans 7 is talking about, where there's still a pull from the old nature. Do you see any middle ground between spontaneous and forced obedience?
Well, I've tried not to say much after the feedback comments. But now
May I say something else here, too? I get frustrated here on Wednesday nights because so often all we get is just comments in the mics. I think this is a good time for questions and answers. You know? I come away here thinking, I wish I could have asked him about that. So tonight I am. And I hope other people will ask questions they can get answers on. Thank you.
No, I personally do not see any middle ground between spontaneous and forced obedience. Does that relieve your frustration any?
No. Because that's where I'm living, see?
Yeah.
Am I to understand then that sanctification is an instantaneous experience?
This was one of our major...
How do we grow?
Yeah, this is one of our major premises earlier, that the ultimate power that is available to the person who's depending upon God totally is available to the beginning Christian now, at any time that he's depending totally upon God. Therefore, the growth, we tried to point out earlier, the growth is in the more and more constant dependence.
But don't you think that we can learn to depend on God more fully as we mature as Christians?
Well...
And doesn't that more full dependence on God bring more full victories?
The very nature of surrender is at stake here, though. See.
But how can I, at the very beginning of my experience, be completely and absolutely and totally surrendered? See? That's my question. That's my frustration. See? And I haven't had it answered.
The very word surrender suggests totality. There's no such thing as partial surrender, whether it's in a war or in the religious life. Either you are or you aren't. This is the premise. Either we are totally depending upon God or we are totally dependent upon ourselves. There's no partial half and half point.
But we can only be totally surrendered, can't we, as far as we understand what surrender means at that point. And I don't believe that as a brand new Christian, I can understand what surrender means as much as I can after I'm a more mature Christian. You see the kind of questions I have in my mind?
Yes. I hope that I have dialogued long enough to not be charged with copying out, but perhaps everyone sees the point enough of what both of us are trying to say.
You have been listening to another special American Christian Ministries presentation. This recording has been digitally reprocessed from the original audio cassette or reel-to-reel in order to make this CD available. The audio quality was improved as much as possible. International copyright, American Christian Ministries. All rights reserved. To order a copy of this or other presentations, or for a free catalog, please call toll-free 800-233-4450. International calls dial 717-652-7000. You may also order from our secure website at www.americanchristianministries.org. There you will discover the largest selection of authentic Adventist preaching available. American Christian Ministries is not a one-man band. It is an orchestra of outstanding speakers who are all on the same theological page. If American Christian Ministries has been a blessing to you, why not take a moment just now and send us a note or an email with your testimony? We'll share it with our speakers and volunteer workers to encourage them. Your prayers and continued financial support are very important to ensure the continuation of this ministry as we help prepare America and the world to meet Jesus Christ. He's coming soon.